God says once a week, you are going to rest. Once a week, you are going to stop working. What would that have sounded like if you were an Israelite who grew up in a world where you worked long hours, 7 days a week, and you were beat if you were not making your quota of bricks? What would Sabbath have sounded like to your ears? The concept of God saying, you're important not because of what you do, but simply who you are, and so you deserve to find rest. God elaborates a couple chapters later on this concept of Sabbath. In Exodus 23, he says, you have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the seventh day, you must stop working. This gives your ox and your donkey a chance to rest. It also allows your servants and the foreigners living among you to be refreshed. In our day and age, in our culture, we often think of Sabbath as something that you do individually. It is for personal rest and growth. And that is true. That is one aspect of Sabbath. But what we're learning about in this story is that Sabbath is not just for you personally. Sabbath is for every living thing. God has instituted the system of Sabbath to affect every living thing in our world. God says, even your ox and your donkey, right? The animals that help with your labor, they need to take a rest once a week. God says, the foreign laborers living among you, your servants, the most vulnerable people in your society, they deserve a rest once a week. What God is saying is that Sabbath is a new system for how the world can operate, and it affects not just you, but it affects everybody, including the most vulnerable. What we see in our scripture today is that there truly are two separate ways to operate the world. There's Pharaoh's way of operating the world, and there's God's way. In Pharaoh's world, there is no end to work. In Pharaoh's world, the work is exploitive. And in Pharaoh's world, it's always production over people. But God's world is different than that. No, in God's world, there is weekly rest. And in God's world, there is rest for all people and all things. And God's mantra is always people over production. Later on, in the next book in the Bible, if you keep on reading in the book of Leviticus, God does something even further than this. God says there has to be a Sabbath year. Once every 7 years, there should be a Sabbath year where nobody does any farming, nobody produces any crops. God says the land itself should have a rest, have a break. And God promises the people, when he wrote that, God says, I will give you enough of what you need to make it through that 7th year, that Sabbath year, so that you can depend only on me and not what you produce. In essence, what God is saying is that Sabbath is a big concept because it affects you, it affects the most vulnerable in society, it affects your animals, it affects the land itself, this rhythm, this concept of rest. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann puts it like this. He says, Sabbath, in the first instance, is not about worship. It is about work stoppage. It is about withdrawal from the anxiety system of Pharaoh and the refusal to let one's life be defined by production and consumption and the endless pursuit of private well-being. See, what Walter is saying is that Sabbath is a statement that God is making about how God views people. And God is concerned with all people and all of creation. And he views them with inherent worth and not just cogs in a machine. In God's world, there is no bottom of the pyramid. There are just people. And so what we learn today is that Sabbath is also a form of resistance. Resistance to this mindset of production over people. And as Christians, then, we have an opportunity to do all that we can to care for people, by structuring society in a way that values rest for all people and for all things. Amen.